All right, if you're serious about a career in sports management, there are a few court cases you absolutely have to know inside and out. And trust me, this is one of them. We're going to break down a huge Supreme Court decision that really dictates how professional sports leagues have to operate today. Let's dive into American Needle versus the NFL.
And it all kicks off right here. The wild part about this whole thing is that this massive antitrust battle, one that called the entire structure of the NFL into question, it wasn't about player salaries or TV rights worth billions. Nope, it was about who gets to make and sell hats. A simple fight over headwear that somehow spiraled all the way to the highest court in the land. And that fight forces us to ask this really strange central question. I mean, every Sunday we watch 32 different teams go to war on the field, all competing for fans, for money, for glory. But when it came time to sell merch, the NFL turned around and argued they weren't competitors at all. They claimed they were just one single business. So what are they? 32 separate companies or one giant one? Okay, so to figure that out, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at how that fight over a hat even started, this whole thing. Then we'll get into the NFL's very clever legal argument, the single entity defense. After that, we'll see how the Supreme Court came up with a test to cut right through that argument, which led to a frankly shocking unanimous decision. And finally, we'll talk about something called the rule of reason, and, most importantly, why this case still matters so much today. So let's start at the beginning. How does a basic disagreement over licensing blow up into a Supreme Court case? Well, it all started with a company called American Needle and the business relationship they'd had with the NFL for decades. For nearly 40 years, everything was pretty simple. See, back in '63, all the NFL teams got together and created a licensing arm called National Football League Properties, or NFLP. Its job was to give out licenses for merch. American Needle got one of those licenses, a not exclusive one, to make hats. But then, in December of 2000, the 32 teams all voted to completely change the playbook. They decided to let the NFLP grant one single exclusive license for the whole league. Why? Well, they probably figured one huge deal with a big-name brand was worth way more money. So in 2001, they did it. They signed a massive 10-year exclusive deal with Reebok. And just like that, American Needle's license was gone. They were cut out completely. So they sued, arguing that the 32 teams had illegally conspired to kill their business. Now, this is where the lawyers get really creative. Facing this big antitrust lawsuit, the NFL didn't try to argue that their exclusive deal was actually good for the market. No, they made a way bigger, way bolder argument. They said they were legally incapable of conspiring at all. So, to get what they were saying, you gotta know a little about Section 1 of the Sherman Antitrust Act. This law basically goes after what's called concerted action. That's just a legal term for when separate, independent companies conspire together to choke out competition. The law is way, way tougher on that kind of group action than on something a single company does by itself. American Needle said the 32 teams acting together was a textbook violation. The NFL's response was honestly pretty genius. They just said, how can we conspire with ourselves? Their whole argument was that when it comes to licensing things like team logos, the 32 teams aren't separate businesses. They claim they were all operating as one single, unified economic machine. This is what lawyers call the single entity defense. It's the idea that if a bunch of businesses all act as one big enterprise, with one brain making the decisions, they can't violate Section 1. You know, the CEO of a company can't legally conspire with her own marketing department. They're all part of the same team. And the NFL was arguing that when it came to selling hats, all 32 teams were part of that one team. And you know what? The lower courts actually bought it. But when the case got to the Supreme Court, they had a totally different view. The justices decided to look past the NFL's fancy corporate structure and see how the teams actually behaved in the real world. They basically created a reality check. And this quote from Justice Stevens just nails it. He wrote that what matters is substance, not form. It doesn't matter what you call yourselves on paper. The real question is, does this deal bring together separate businesses that are each looking out for their own bottom line? If the answer is yes, well, then you're looking at a potential conspiracy. So the court applied this test and asked, are the 32 NFL teams really separate economic actors? And the answer was, yeah, of course they are. They're all independently owned. They all fight tooth and nail for fans, for ticket sales, for the best players and coaches. And here's the kicker for this case. They're all potential competitors in the intellectual property market. A hat company could just try to make a deal with the Eagles, or just with the Chiefs. At their core, these are 32 different businesses all trying to make as much money as possible for themselves.
The NFL's counter was, hey, we have to work together to even create our product, which is NFL football. The court shot that down with this fantastic analogy. They said, look, a nut and a bolt only work together. But that doesn't give all the nut makers and all the bolt makers a free pass to get together and fix prices. Just because you have to cooperate on one thing doesn't give you immunity from antitrust law on everything else.
So after taking apart the NFL's entire argument, piece by piece, the court was ready to deliver its verdict. And the way they did it? Well, it sent a massive shockwave through the entire world of sports. The vote was 9-0. Unanimous. Every single justice on the court agreed. When the Supreme Court speaks with one voice like that, it's basically saying the answer is obvious. There was no debate. There was no doubt. And the verdict was crystal clear. That licensing deal cooked up by the 32 teams was concerted action between separate businesses. And that means it has to follow antitrust law. End of story. The NFL's single entity shield was completely shattered. Okay, now here is a really important point, especially for anyone going into sports management. The Supreme Court did not say that the NFL's exclusive deal with Reebok was illegal. All they said was that the NFL couldn't use the single entity defense to get the lawsuit thrown out. This is a critical distinction. The case wasn't over. It was really just beginning. So what happens next? Well, two things. First, the NFL's get-out-of-jail-free card, their single entity defense, is gone. They now have to actually defend their deal on its merits. Second, the case gets kicked back down to the lower courts to continue, but now it's going to be judged by a whole new standard, a legal test they call the rule of reason. The rule of reason is basically just a big balancing act. A court has to weigh the pros and cons. Does the practice, in this case an exclusive league-wide hot deal, actually help competition in some ways, or does it hurt competition more? The NFL would now have the tough job of proving that their deal with Reebok was, on balance, a reasonable thing to do and not just a conspiracy to shut out smaller companies. In the end, the case actually settled out of court, so we never got a final verdict on the Reebok deal itself. But the Supreme Court's ruling from this case has had a gigantic, lasting impact. Let's wrap up with why this decision is so important for anyone working in the sports industry. So, what's the bottom line here? American Needle was a wake-up call for every sports league. It said, you are not above the law. You don't get a special exemption from antitrust rules just because you're a sports league. Courts are always going to look at the economic reality, the substance, not the form. And that legal precedent now affects every single league-wide deal you can think of, from the Madden video game to merchandise to those multi-billion-dollar TV and streaming contracts that the industry runs on. And that leaves us with a huge question for the future. The court drew a line in the sand over hats, but where else does that line get drawn? Are teams separate businesses when they all get together to negotiate a TV deal with Fox or a streaming deal with Apple? What about when they bargain with the players' union? The test from American Needle is the exact framework that will be used to answer all of those billion-dollar questions for years to come.